And it really was only then did I get an idea of that there was this monumental explosion inside the Sari Club after the bomb at Paddy's Bar, and so many people had been trapped. There was a fire and they couldn't get out. That was what happened. Some people got out. I spoke to one guy who lost his wife and daughter. He was asking me, can you just check on my wife and daughter? They're around somewhere. And of course, they didn't make it out. He got transported back to Australia. And of course, at one point I did walk up to this one guy who I thought was he looked like a rugby player to me, big head. He just looked big. And I had no idea that he was in such a bad way.
And even 20 years on, it still is so horrific to think about. One of the more notable faces of the tragedy is that of Peter Hughes. You found him in the hospital. You were the first to speak to him. Tell us about that. Yeah,
well, he was, as I say, he was just one of those guys. He was sitting there. He got up out of his off the stretcher there when I asked his carer, could I talk to him? I still remember her leaning down. It's Mark Burrows from Channel 9 can talk to him. And he got up, positioned him up, and there he was. He chatted to me. He was just one of the many interviews that I did, and but we talked for about 3 minutes or so, and he had that calm way of expressing himself, that he was okay. There were worse off people than him, and it's a funny job we've got. You don't know sometimes what interviews you do will resonate more than others. And of course, when I eventually came back to Australia, everybody said that interview that you did with that guy. And I was a bit taken aback because I said, well, I did lots of interviews. They said, no, that really affected them. That really, it really just, it got under their skin. He was just so self-deprecating, thinking of other people. And of course, he went through hell, Peter. And when the doctor saw that interview, they said, you need to help him. He's about to die. And of course, they did help him. Peter got on the Hercules, and they did some surgery on him in the plane to ease the discomfort he was feeling, and of course he did survive.
And I think it was because he kept saying, I'm okay, there's people worse off than me, but clearly he was in a pretty bad way. Now, 20 years ago, that was your first time to Barli. You've been back many times since then, and at the time you wouldn't have known.
No, I had no idea of what was about to unfold. This was at the time on the day it became clear that it was a terrorist attack, but then the numbers started coming up, 202 people killed, 88 Australians, but it was the enormity of such a horrendous terror attack so close to Australia. That moment effectively defined my life for the next 6 years. I was up there month on month doing the court case for the bombers. I was there for the execution of the bombers, the investigations that all took place, and all the while, of course, the anniversaries that just ticked by, and the families were back here trying to deal with the grief. There were all these things going on, and I'd come back here sometimes for some of the anniversaries, and still to this day it does affect me. It affects me enormously what these people went through.
I think it's because so many of us have been to Barli, and it could have been so many of us that it does resonate with everyday Australians. Now, you've been in the news game for decades. You've been at the network for a very long time. This is one of the biggest stories of your career, one of the biggest events that you've covered. What sticks with you about the Barli bombings?
Well, we've all done stories. I recently did some stories on the Queen, presidents, really big stories involving big names. But this was different. The people involved in this story were your auntie, your uncle, your mother, your father, your brother, your sister. And that's what got to me. These were people that, when we spoke to the relatives after, their stories really got to me. Felt very emotional. I remember for the first couple of weeks when the cameraman would leave my room after I'd put my voice down on the tape, I have to say it, I shed a tear for days, because the enormity of what people were going through. We were talking to families and relatives, and the enormity of what their grief and what they were going through, it got to you, and it really did affect you. And it was because it was so easy to empathise with what they were going through. Ordinary Australians going to Bali for that big holiday that everyone had dreamed of. I'd been to Bali on holiday before. I knew the club, knew what it was all about. And unfortunately, so many of these great Australians who went there just to have some fun didn't make it.
Well, your work 20 years ago was extraordinary, as it is today. Mark Burrows, thank you for your insight.
Thanks, Lizzie.
And thank you to Mark and Lizzie. Well, there's now some justice for Australians who are owed thousands of dollars after being sold dodgy junk insurance nearly 20 years ago, but it can come at a cost. Business reporter Chris Kohler explains.
Around 1 in 4 Australians have been ripped off by their bank for